This all happened during a trek through the Appalachian Mountains. 4 of my friends and I had set out on what we thought would be a thrilling adventure, an escape into the untamed wilderness, a chance to disconnect from the world. At around 7:30 a.m., we packed up our campsite and began our journey, completely unaware of the nightmare that lay ahead. After hiking for about an hour or two, we finally arrived at the trailhead. Excitement buzzed through the group, though there was a hint of nervous energy in the air as well. But before we could even start, I ran into a problem: luggage. My so-called friends, in their infinite wisdom, decided it would be hilarious to dump all their bags on me and scatter off in different directions, their laughter echoing through the trees. I barely had time to protest before they disappeared into the dense forest, leaving me struggling under the weight of our gear. As the hours ticked by, daylight slowly began to fade. The towering trees cast long shadows, and the once welcoming woods started to feel cold and uninviting. The cheerful sounds of my friends' voices had long since vanished, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. I called out their names, but the forest swallowed my voice whole. A creeping sense of unease settled in my chest, stirring up an old, deep-seated fear of the dark. Desperately searching for any sign of light or direction, my eyes landed on a faint glow in the distance. Squinting through the thick foliage, I spotted the flickering light of a lantern, gently swaying at the entrance of a small, isolated cabin hidden among the trees. Dragging the heavy luggage behind me, I trudged toward the cabin, exhaustion pressing down on every step. By the time I reached the door, my watch read 11:53 p.m. Knocking on a stranger's door at that hour was unsettling, but at this point, I had no other option. Taking a deep breath, I raised a trembling hand and rang the doorbell. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man. His eyes were dull, yet they held a strange intensity, as if they could see straight through me. He took one look at my worn-out state and, without a word, motioned for me to come inside. His voice was raspy but oddly warm as he handed me a glass of water and a plate of rice. Hunger and exhaustion left me with no time for suspicion. I devoured the food without hesitation. After I finished eating, the old man offered me a room to rest and firmly instructed me to lock the door behind me. Too drained to argue, I nodded, muttered a quick thank you, and collapsed onto the bed. Within moments, I was out cold. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up with a start. A strange metallic sound echoed through the cabin. My pulse quickened as I lay still, trying to place the noise. It was faint but unmistakable. The rhythmic SHHKK, SHHKK, SHHKK of metal against stone. Someone was sharpening a blade. A cold sweat broke out on my skin as I slid out of bed, my movements slow and deliberate. I tiptoed to the door and gently turned the handle, opening it just enough to peer out into the darkness. The sound was coming from below. From the basement. I knew better than to investigate, but something in me just had to see. Against every ounce of common sense, I crept toward the basement door, which was slightly ajar. My fingers trembled as I nudged it open just enough to peek inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The old man was crouched over a grinding wheel, methodically sharpening a long, gleaming knife. The rhythmic screech of metal against stone sent shivers down my spine. He was muttering under his breath, words I couldn't quite make out, but they chilled me all the same. And then it hit me. This knife wasn't for cooking. It wasn't for some ordinary task. It was meant for me. Panic surged through me. My foot shifted backward, knocking over a small table behind me. The crash echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. The old man's head snapped toward the sound. I didn't wait to see what happened next. My body acted on pure adrenaline. I bolted toward the front door, my heart hammering in my chest. My hands fumbled at the knob. Locked. I spun around, searching desperately for another way out. That's when my eyes landed on a side window leading to the backyard. And that's when I saw them. Gravestones. Half buried beneath the overgrown grass, their worn edges barely visible in the dim light. My stomach lurched. I could feel the blood draining from my face. This wasn't just some remote cabin. It was a graveyard. A graveyard for people just like me. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps shook me back to reality. He was looking for me. Frantically, I searched the room for anything I could use as a weapon. My hands landed on something small and cylindrical, a can of pepper spray. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Clutching it tight, I pressed myself behind the door, barely breathing. The footsteps grew closer. The door creaked open. The second he stepped through, I sprang forward and sprayed him directly in the face. The reaction was instant. He let out a guttural scream, clutching his eyes as the knife clattered to the floor. Blinded, he stumbled toward the sink, gasping and cursing as he fumbled for water. I didn't hesitate. My eyes darted across the floor until, there, I spotted a small, rusted key. Snatching it up, I ran to the front door, shoved it into the lock, and twisted with everything I had. The door swung open. I ran. I don't know how long I sprinted through those dark woods, my lungs burning with every breath. By some miracle, I stumbled upon a small encampment, and lying there, completely unaware of what had just happened, was one of my friends. I shook him awake, hysterical, words spilling out of me in a frantic mess. He barely had time to react before I was dragging him to wake the others. By morning, we had reported everything to the nearest police station. And that's when things got even stranger. When we returned with the authorities, my stomach twisted into knots. The cabin, the same one I had just escaped from, was no longer the small but sturdy dwelling I remembered. It was a decaying ruin. The walls were crumbling, overtaken by vines and moss. The door barely hung on its hinges. The inside was completely empty, except for one thing: our luggage. The old man? Gone. But what sent chills straight through me was what hung on the wall. A single, faded portrait of the old man, still clinging to a rusted nail. Beneath it, carved into the wooden frame, was a date. The year? Over a decade ago. The man I had seen. The man who had fed me. The man who had hunted me had been dead for years. For weeks, I barely slept. Even now, I refused to go trekking, because deep in the Appalachian Mountains, in the dark corners of the wilderness, something is still lurking. And I have no intention of ever crossing its path again. I almost gave up. I want to share something that happened the week I turned 26. My whole life, I'd battled depression and anxiety. It always seemed to hold me back, keeping me from opportunities and pushing away people I cared about. At the time, I had just proposed to a woman I truly believed I'd spend forever with. I had a steady job, and we had just moved into our own place. Everything should have been good, but the truth is, sometimes all it takes is one bad day to flip your whole world upside down. I was working construction back then, which meant dragging myself out of bed before the sun even thought about rising. That particular morning, I was completely drained, physically, mentally, you name it. I just wasn't in the right headspace. Still, I showed up and tried to push through, but my wonderful boss wouldn't give me a moment's peace. Every single nail I hammered, every board I cut, nothing was ever good enough for him. And to make matters worse, most of the guys I worked with were either strung out or half-drunk, barely able to stand, yet somehow, they made the same paycheck I did. Then came the moment that set everything off. I went to drive a nail, and it bent. No big deal, right? Well, apparently, my boss thought otherwise. He ripped the hammer right out of my hands and sneered at me, calling me a useless millennial like I was some kind of joke. I tried to shake it off and took my lunch break early, hoping some time alone would help. But the second I got to my truck, I found another surprise waiting for me. One of my junky coworkers digging through my stuff like it was his own. Furious, I ran over and yanked him out, ready to give him a piece of my mind. But before I could even react, my boss came out of nowhere, slammed me to the ground, and pinned me down. Turns out, the junkie was his son. And of course, in his eyes, his boy could do no wrong. Instead of dealing with the fact that his kid was stealing from me, he turned the whole thing on me, threatening to report me for assault. I tried to defend myself, to explain what had actually happened, but no one cared. They just threw insult after insult at me, like I was the villain in the whole mess. That was it. I was done. I walked off the job during my break and never looked back. No paycheck was worth that kind of humiliation and abuse. I knew my fiancée probably wouldn't be thrilled about it, but at that moment, none of it mattered. I knew I could find another job. There was no rule saying I had to stay at that one. But the bad news didn't stop when I got home. Lately, things between my fiancée and me had been strained. The exhaustion from work drained me every single day, leaving me too numb to be present in our relationship. Instead of spending time with her, I'd retreat into my own world, gaming, reading, anything to avoid talking. I figured she understood, but I was dead wrong. When I stepped inside, the place felt eerily empty. No sounds, no signs of life, just a single note sitting on the kitchen table. It was from her, of course. 7 simple words that hit me harder than I ever expected. You're not the person I used to know. And just like that, she was gone. I called her, texted her, reached out to anyone who might know where she went. Nothing. No answers, no explanations. Just silence. I collapsed onto the couch and let out a long, shaky sigh. As if fighting my own demons every day wasn't hard enough, now I was completely alone. The one person I thought would always be by my side had walked away without a second thought. All in a single day. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just emptiness. And in that moment, I stopped caring about what came next. The future didn't seem real anymore. It didn't matter. I got up, walked to the closet, and grabbed the weapon my father had given me years ago. Then I climbed into my truck and started driving. There was a spot. A well-known place where people went when they decided they'd had enough. It sat on the edge of a river, quiet and peaceful. I guess if I had to go, I might as well do it somewhere beautiful. By the time I got there, the moon was high, casting its reflection over the water. I sat down on the sandbar and just stared out at it, letting my mind drift. I thought back on my life. How I had always been a loner. How hard it was for me to open up, to let anyone in. I truly believed I had found someone who understood me. But in the end, even she got tired. Tired of trying to break through the thick walls I had built around myself. And to be honest, I was tired too. I took one last look at the world around me before pulling out the weapon. Eyes closed, I was ready. At least I thought I was, until I heard footsteps and a dull thud beside me. I opened my eyes and found a stranger sitting next to me. He was thin, ragged-looking, with clothes that had definitely seen better days. There was dirt on his face, but he smiled at me like we were old friends. "Nice night, huh?" he said casually. I hesitated, not sure what to make of him. But somehow I answered, "I guess so." He let out a slow sigh, staring out at the water before speaking again. "So, Are we doing this? The man asked, his tone eerily casual. I blinked, confused. Doing what? He scoffed. Don't play dumb, kid. People only come out here for one reason. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I started to stand, ready to put as much distance between us as possible. But before I could move, his hand shot out, gripping my arm. He gave me a grin, wild, unhinged. Relax, kid. I know what I'm doing. The other 7 looked so happy when it was over. My stomach dropped. The other 7? That was all I needed to hear. I ripped my arm away and bolted, my heart pounding harder with every step. But the second I turned back, my worst fear was confirmed. He was right behind me, keeping pace like he'd done this before. Come on, kid! No need to be scared. You wanna die anyway. I'm just trying to help. His voice sent ice through my veins, but I kept running, pushing myself harder, desperate to reach my truck. But no matter how fast I moved, I could hear his footsteps closing in. With no other choice, I yanked my dad's gun from my waistband and spun around, aiming it straight at him. Back off, you psycho! I swear I'll shoot! But instead of fear, he just laughed, a deep, guttural laugh that made my skin crawl. You're not serious, are you? He taunted. You're no killer, boy. Just look at you, shaking like a leaf. My hands were trembling, but I held firm. I'm not afraid to pull this trigger. You want to test me? But my threats didn't faze him. In a split second, he lunged, knocking the gun from my hands. Before I could react, he tackled me to the ground, his bony fingers wrapping around my throat. Just relax, he whispered, his grin never fading. It'll all be over soon. I gasped, clawing at his hands as my vision blurred. My lungs burned, my strength fading fast. And that's when it hit me, my life, flashing before my eyes. I saw it all. Moments I hadn't thought about in years. My childhood. The laughter of my friends. The warmth of my mother's embrace. The simple joys, a perfect summer day, the taste of my favorite snack, the feeling of falling asleep safe in my bed. Tears welled up in my eyes. I had come here to end it. I thought I was ready. But now I wasn't so sure that I wasn't about to let some deranged lunatic be the one to end my life. Not like this. Not tonight. Summoning every last ounce of strength I had left, I reached out blindly, my fingers scraping against something solid, a rock. Without a second thought, I swung it with everything I had, smashing it against his head. The moment he hit the ground, I took off. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. My heart hammered in my chest, and every step felt like it took an eternity. But when I finally saw my truck, a wave of sheer relief crashed over me. I had never been so grateful to climb inside and fire up the engine. This was my chance. I was going to leave this place, leave this mindset, and stop feeling sorry for myself. I was ready to fight for my life again. But it wasn't over. Just as I threw the truck into gear, gunshots rang out. I looked in the rearview mirror, my stomach twisting into knots. There he was, the same man, but now he was holding my father's pistol. My pistol. And he was firing straight at me. I ducked my head low and floored it, gripping the wheels so tight my knuckles turned white. My only prayer was that I'd make it out of there alive. I didn't let off the gas until I saw the highway, speedometer pushing past 90. Only when I knew I was safe did I finally pull over. That's when it hit me, everything all at once. The fear, the exhaustion, the reality of how close I had come to death. And I broke. I sobbed harder than I ever had in my life, shaking uncontrollably in the driver's seat. I had gone to that river thinking I was ready to die. But I wasn't. I never really was. After that night, I started putting the pieces back together. My fiancée and I reconciled. I found a new job, one that didn't drain the life out of me. We even went to counseling and learned how to truly understand each other. And over the years, I learned to value life. Because the truth is, you never know when it's going to end. Nothing puts that into perspective quite like staring death in the face and realizing you don't actually want to go. But sometimes, I still think about the 7 people he mentioned. 7 lost souls, people who, like me, had come to that place feeling hopeless. But they never got the chance to leave. They never got the chance to pick up the pieces. I can only hope they found peace in whatever comes next. As for that man, sometimes I wonder if he's still out there. Still lurking. Still waiting for his next victim. And I pray that whoever crosses his path is strong enough to make it out alive, like I was. I heard my aunt's voice. But she was already gone. A few months before she passed, my aunt, who was about 60 at the time, seemed to be in good health, at least the last time I saw her. She had lost a little weight, but she seemed pleased about it, so I didn't give it much thought. She was incredibly close to my mom, practically her best friend, and had always been a huge part of my childhood. We took trips together, celebrated holidays as a family. Christmas wouldn't have been the same without her. One particular weekend, I was visiting my boyfriend, staying over at his aunt's and grandparents' house in a different city. That morning, as I was just waking up, I distinctly heard a voice in my head say, "Good morning, campers! Good morning, campers!" It was something my aunt used to say all the time, mostly to annoy us and drag us out of bed. The moment I heard it, I turned to my boyfriend, startled. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He looked at me, completely clueless. "Hear what?" I shook my head. "Never mind. That was weird." At the time, I brushed it off as nothing, just one of those odd things your brain does when you're half asleep. Later that day, I asked if I could use the house phone to call my mom. It was Mother's Day, and I wanted to wish her well. The second she answered, though, I could tell something was wrong. Her voice was thick, like she'd been crying. "Happy Mother's Day," I said. There was a pause before she replied. "It's not a happy Mother's Day." Confused, I asked why. That's when she told me my aunt had passed away. I was in complete shock. I had no idea she had been sick or that anything was even wrong. Apparently, her husband had gone out to the pub the night before and had come home quietly so he wouldn't wake her. But when he woke up in the morning, he realized she was already gone. She had been unwell for a while, but she never told anyone, never sought treatment, never let on that she was struggling. She just kept it to herself. And yet, that very same morning, before I knew anything, before anyone even told me, I heard her voice. The same cheerful, teasing, "Good morning, campers," that she used to say when she was alive. I've never experienced anything like that before. Not once. Not since. But that moment made me wonder. Maybe death isn't the end after all. The house that never slept. I don't care if anyone believes me, this is 100% real. My family has always been deeply connected to the spirit world. Ghosts, energies, things that most people dismiss as imagination. We've felt them, seen them, lived with them. From the time I was 8 until I turned 14, we lived in an old house that was undeniably haunted. Every single night, we'd hear the sound of footsteps creeping up and down the stairs. Shadows moved where no one stood. Low whispers carried through the halls, just quiet enough to make you doubt your own ears. Objects had a way of shifting on their own. One moment they'd be in one place, the next, somewhere entirely different. And the worst part? That feeling. The constant weight of unseen eyes watching you, even when you were completely alone. The presence in the house never felt evil, at least not in an aggressive way. But that didn't make it any less terrifying when things happened. And trust me, they happened. The first time I saw it, I was about 11 years old. It was late, around midnight, and I was lying in bed, reading a book. My door was closed, but I had one of those beaded curtains hanging over it. You know, the kind that made a distinct rustling sound when someone walked through them. I was completely absorbed in my book when suddenly, the beads shifted. Not just a random sway from the air, but a full movement, like someone had pushed right through them. I looked up. The beads were still rocking back and forth, as if someone had just passed into the room. But my door was shut. No one was there. My body locked up in fear. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but I felt it. Then, the mattress at the foot of my bed dipped down, the way it does when someone sits on it. For a single, breathless second, I watched as an invisible weight pressed into the bed, then just as suddenly it lifted. That was it. I snapped. I bolted upright, screaming at the top of my lungs. Nothing was there, no shadows, no figures, just an overwhelming silence. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. I didn't stop running until I reached my mom's room, where I spent the rest of the night curled up beside her. The woman in the mirror. A week passed. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I was overtired or dreaming. But then it happened again. I was up late, watching TV in my room, when I heard them, the footsteps. The same ones we always heard in the hallway at night. Normally, they never scared me too much. But after what had happened in my room, every slow, deliberate step sent ice through my veins. Then, the doorknob rattled. Not once. Not twice. 3 times. As if someone was trying to open it. But the door wasn't locked. I sat frozen, my body rigid with fear. I wanted to scream, but my throat locked up. My family was asleep. No one was around to hear me. The only way out was through that door, and whatever was standing on the other side. I had 2 choices: stay trapped inside the room, or run. So I ran. As I made my way to the door, something made me glance at the mirror on my dresser. And I swear to God, I saw her. A woman. An older woman in a dress, staring back at me. She wasn't menacing. She wasn't trying to scare me. She just smiled. It lasted only a second. A flicker. A moment so brief I could have dismissed it as a trick of the light. Except I know what I saw. I barely remember getting out of that room. All I know is I ended up back in my mom's bed, refusing to sleep alone for the next 2 weeks. The house's secrets. Things like this happen all the time in that house. Not every night, not always as intense, but enough that we knew we weren't alone. We later learned that multiple people had died there over the years. Maybe that explained the presence. Maybe that's why it never felt hostile, just there. Watching. No one ever got hurt. Nothing ever physically touched us. But the feeling, I'll never forget it. Most people don't believe me when I tell this story. And honestly, I don't blame them. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I'll never forget the woman in the mirror. I was 11 years old when my family was in a car accident. We were driving home after my sister's soccer game, tired but buzzing with energy. My siblings and I had been begging Dad to stop at McDonald's the whole way, wearing him down little by little. He gave us the usual dad responses. We have food at home, and money doesn't grow on trees. But we knew the drill. If we pushed just enough, there was always a chance. I saw him glance at Mom, whisper something, and then slowly start changing lanes. That was the moment we knew. Excitement rippled through the back seat, though none of us dared to say a word. We had learned that Dad liked to play these little games, turning denials into surprises at the last second. Like the time he told me we had to stop at the bank after school, only to pull up to the ice cream shop instead. Or when he woke us up early on a Saturday, claiming we had a doctor's appointment, but actually took us mini-golfing and to the arcade. Mom pretended to roll her eyes at these surprises, but we knew she loved them just as much as we did. Even something as small as a Happy Meal felt special when Dad did it this way. The turn signal blinked. The traffic light shifted to green. Dad stepped on the gas. I was lost in thought, imagining what toy would come with my meal. I didn't see anything, but I heard it. Dad's voice, loud and panicked. "Oh my God!" Then, blackness. Waking up somewhere else. I woke up seconds later. At least, it felt like seconds later. I wasn't in the car anymore. The world around me was a blur, shapeless, bright, disorienting. The lights above were so intense it felt like staring straight into the sun. I tried to move, but my body felt impossibly heavy, like I was pinned down by an invisible force. A creeping sense of panic clawed at my chest. My breathing quickened. Then a voice. Soft, calm. "Hey buddy, it's okay. Easy now." I turned my head toward the voice. There was a woman standing beside me. At first, she looked purple. My vision was slowly coming back, sharpening bit by bit. No, she wasn't purple. It was her shirt. And her pants. Scrubs. She was a nurse. For a brief, ridiculous second, my dazed mind wondered, did Dad actually take us to the doctor's office instead of McDonald's? It sounded absurd, but none of this made sense. Nothing felt real. I tried to fight the rising panic, but it was bubbling up too fast. The nurse must have seen it in my eyes. "It's okay. It's okay. Try to stay calm. You've been through a lot. Your parents will be so happy to know that you're awake." Her voice was warm and steady, like an anchor in the chaos. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what had happened. But somehow, I believed her. And for now, that was enough. "It's okay. It's okay. Try to stay calm. You've been through a lot. Your parents will be so happy to know that you're awake." The nurse's voice was warm and reassuring, but my mind was spinning. Nothing made sense. I had so many questions. What happened? Where am I? Where's Mom? My thoughts tumbled over each other, too fast to grab onto any one of them. My mouth felt dry, my throat tight. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a weak, shaky, "W what?" The nurse's expression softened. She sat down beside me and carefully explained what had happened. We were in a car accident. A driver had run a red light at full speed just as my dad was making his turn. They plowed straight into us. She told me we must have had an angel watching over us, because miraculously, everyone in our car survived. The same couldn't be said for the other car. I barely processed that part before she kept going. Apparently, I took the worst of it. I had been in a coma for 5 days. At first, they didn't think I was going to make it. The first couple of days looked bad. But by the third day, I started improving, little by little. She gave me a small smile, as if trying to keep me grounded. Then, after sitting with me for another moment, she stood up. "I'm going to get your parents," she said gently. A lump formed in my throat. Mom and Dad. They must have been terrified. Mom probably had chewed her nails down to nothing by now. She always did when she was stressed. Dad was definitely blaming himself, even though it wasn't his fault. And Jenny. God, Jenny. She got anxious over the littlest things. She still crawled into my bed whenever there was a thunderstorm. I didn't even want to imagine what she'd been like these past 5 days, thinking her big brother might die. But the nurse had said my family was safe. I was awake now. That meant everything was going to be okay. At least, that's what I thought. Then the hospital door opened again. The nurse walked back in, only this time, she wasn't alone. A man and a woman followed behind her. They both had bandages on their faces. The man's arm was in a cast. The second the woman saw me, she gasped and rushed forward. "Oh, thank God!" she cried, tears filling her eyes. She reached out like she was about to hug me. The man stayed a step behind, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. His voice was calm but full of relief. "I told you he was a fighter. I knew you'd pull through." My body stiffened. Something was wrong. I blinked hard, willing my vision to clear. Maybe I was still disoriented. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no. It wasn't just their faces. It was their voices. The way they spoke. The way they looked at me. These weren't my parents. I didn't know these people. The woman leaned in again, trying to embrace me, and I jerked back instinctively. My heart pounded. Panic surged in my chest as I stammered. There must be a mistake. I don't know you. Where are my parents?" "Don't be silly," the woman says, wiping tears from her face. "It's me, baby. It's Mom." A cold wave of dread crashes over me. No. I know my mother. And this woman is not her. Mom hates pet names. She won't even shorten my name. To her, I've always been Matthew. Never Matt. And definitely never baby or sweetie. The panic rises like a knot in my throat. My breathing is ragged, my chest tight. My voice is louder now, on the edge of shouting. "You're not my mom! I don't know you! Where is my mom? Where is my dad? And where is Jenny?" The woman's face falls. Slowly, she backs away, glancing toward the nurse with wide, glassy eyes. "Is he okay?" she asks, her voice shaking. He doesn't recognize me?" The nurse steps forward, her expression careful, professional. "After severe trauma, some patients experience short-term memory loss. He may be disoriented. It could take time for him to regain full clarity." I shake my head violently. No, this isn't confusion. I know exactly who my parents are. And these people standing in front of me aren't them. I can hear the desperation in my own voice now, rising in pitch, nearing a scream. "I know my parents! They are not my parents!" I stab a finger in their direction to make my point crystal clear. "And where is my sister? Where's Jenny?" The woman gasps like I just punched her in the gut. "Sweetie, who's Jenny? You don't have a sister." Her voice is thick with emotion, but her words make my blood run cold. I feel like the air has been sucked out of the room. "Nurse, you have to do something," the woman pleads, now near hysterics. "There has to be some kind of brain damage. He's not making any sense." Sweetie. There it is again. That forced affection. That false familiarity. Mom would never call me that. My body tenses. My instinct screamed that something is very, very wrong. The panic inside me twists into something sharper, something hotter. Rage. I thrash against the bed, yanking at the covers, trying to force my limbs to move. I need to get out. I need to find my real family. I need to wake up from this nightmare. When I was growing up, I couldn't stand the summers. My friends and classmates would come back to school, excitedly talking about all the fun things they'd done during the break. Trips to water parks, hanging out at rec centers, or going to camps where they'd sit around campfires, tell creepy stories, and roast marshmallows. But I never had anything to add to those conversations. From the time I was in first grade until fourth grade, my summer stories were always boring, uneventful, nothing special at all. That changed, though, when I was 11. One year, I came back with a story that wasn't just dull or boring. It was downright terrifying. Summer breaks were always miserable for me because my parents would send me to stay with my grandpa. It was a tradition that seemed to start for no reason at all. He lived a couple towns over, in this old Victorian house that was surrounded by farmland, and it looked like something straight out of a horror movie, kind of like the house from The Conjuring. There was even this eerie forest of birch trees nearby, and a quiet, still pond that always looked dark and dirty. Grandpa was a tall, thin, pale guy with a bald head that reminded me of a big, speckled egg. He had this long, crooked nose that made me think of a witch, and his dark, beady eyes never seemed to show any real emotion, not even when he saw me, his own grandson, after a whole year. He wore drab clothes, always sweater vests and button-up shirts, paired with these slacks I thought people only wore for church or funerals. Grandpa didn't talk much, and it was clear he didn't like people. He'd yell at anyone who visited, and he had a "Beware of dog" sign, even though he hated dogs. He didn't have any pets at all. The sign was just there to keep strangers away. Spending a few months straight at Grandpa's place was pure torture for a kid like me, especially with how outdated everything was. His TV was one of those old models with a huge back and an antenna. Most of the channels didn't come through, and whatever kids' shows I could find were either super religious, like badly animated Bible stories, or these lame learning programs for little kids, like a worse version of Coco Melon from the 90s. My options for entertainment were slim. I could read a book, play with the 2 toys I was allowed to bring, or go outside to play, but only after I finished my chores, of course. Every Sunday, Grandpa would take me to the church in the nearest town. During the week, he had me help him out with different volunteer jobs, like working at the soup kitchen or handing out resources to homeless folks on the street. It doesn't sound too bad, right? But spending hours in the scorching sun, with no shade, handing out deodorants and cans of food to people in need? That was hell for a kid who just wanted to sit inside and watch TV or play my Nintendo DS. Sadly, the one I had to leave at home. Every night, we'd pray before bed, and I'd say grace before every meal. The meals themselves weren't anything special. My parents were great cooks, but Grandpa's food was always bland, poorly seasoned, and mostly boiled until it turned a pale, unappetizing color. Grandpa wasn't the most loving guy, but I always felt like he cared for me in his own way. He just didn't really know how to show it. He'd always ask me if I liked my dinner after I finished the last bite, and I'd always lie and tell him it was great. He'd also ask if I wanted to hear a bedtime story, but I'd always say no, telling him I was too old for that stuff, even though, deep down, I didn't really feel that way. But then, the summer before I was about to start 5th grade, something strange happened. Grandpa changed. When my mom dropped me off, parking her old, beat-up Cadillac in the yard and nudging me toward the door, I immediately felt like something was off about the whole place. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I remember standing on the porch with my mom as she knocked, again and again, with no answer. I remember thinking to myself, "It's so quiet." I didn't hear the usual birds or squirrels, and the breeze we had earlier seemed to disappear, leaving the trees completely still. Even the toads, which usually croaked by the pond, were silent. Finally, Grandpa opened the door, peeking through a crack. He looked unsettled. There was a look on his face I had never seen before. He looked paler than usual, and his eyes were open wider than they needed to be. He stared at us like he'd forgotten we were coming, like I hadn't arrived on the same day every year, like Mom hadn't called him a week ahead of time, just like she always did. "Dad, are you okay?" Mom asked, concerned. Grandpa blinked, as if he was snapping back into reality. He shook his head and opened the door a little wider. "Sorry, I was just sleeping." Right away, I knew he was lying. Grandpa had a strict routine. He always woke up at the same time every morning and stayed awake the entire day until bedtime. If anything messed with that routine, he'd get angry and wouldn't say a word for the rest of the day. Like every year, Mom stayed long enough to have lunch with us at Grandpa's long, rectangular dining table. I always thought it was funny how big it was, considering Grandpa lived alone. His wife, my grandma, had passed away before I was even born. So anyway, we ate tuna sandwiches cut into neat little triangles, with toothpicks sticking out of olives, and drank prune juice. After that, Mom left. I braced myself for another boring summer, wishing I was riding roller coasters or hanging out at community pools like my friends were. But after a few days, things started to get strange. One morning, I woke up at 6 a.m. because Grandpa had set the alarm on my nightstand to go off at that time, just like his. After getting ready, I went downstairs to watch the old TV while I waited for him to start cooking breakfast, like he always did. But after 2 hours of watching, I suddenly realized something. It was way too quiet. I hadn't heard Grandpa walking around, and there were no sounds of him cooking. I stood up from where I'd been sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, and when I turned around, my heart sank. Grandpa was standing there, right behind the couch, still in his striped pajamas. He stared at me with these lifeless eyes, his mouth slightly open, like I was some strange creature he didn't recognize, and it seemed to disgust him. How long had he been standing there? Why wasn't he dressed? Grandpa loved his routine. Why had he broken it? "Grandpa?" I asked, genuinely concerned after I got over the shock of seeing him just standing there. He was old, but his mind was still sharp. He'd never done anything like this before. He didn't answer. He just stared, like he was looking right through me. "Grandpa?" I asked, more urgently this time, wondering if I should call someone. "More." "What?" I frowned, confused. "More what?" It was like he snapped back to reality. His eyes blinked rapidly, and he finally seemed to recognize I was there. He glanced down at himself, grumbling in frustration. "Damn it!" I watched as he marched upstairs to change, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. Honestly, I didn't know what to think. I got over it pretty quickly, though. Yeah, it was weird, but I trusted Grandpa. I figured he just had a moment, maybe a brain fart or something. We had a late breakfast, and through the whole meal, he pushed his food around, muttering under his breath about something I couldn't understand. I swallowed the runny poached eggs, gathered my courage, and asked, "Grandpa, is something wrong? I just haven't been sleeping much lately." He waved me off, looking grumpy and refusing to even make eye contact. "Don't worry about it. Are we doing anything today?" I asked, already so bored that I was starting to look forward to doing charity work. Nope. I'm going back to bed. I'm not feeling well. Grandpa got up abruptly, wiping his mouth with a napkin, and stormed upstairs. I sat there, uncomfortable, wondering if I'd done something to upset him. He stayed in bed all day. When evening came, I tried waking him up to help make dinner, but he told me to make myself a ham sandwich and put myself to bed. Instead, I decided to go outside and explore. I went over to the pond and started skipping rocks, trying to distract myself and wondering if I could somehow use everything that was happening as a reason to avoid coming back next year. A growing sense of unease washed over me as I realized just how eerily quiet it was again. I didn't hear any bugs, animals, or anything like usual. In fact, there were a lot of dead frogs, turtles, and lizards floating on the surface of the pond, more than what seemed normal. By the tree where an old tire swing hung, there was a bird lying on its back, decaying next to broken little eggshells. I tried to ignore it, focusing on finding more rocks to skip across the water. I wanted to convince myself that I was too old to be bothered by stuff like this. But what I couldn't ignore was the sound of bubbles rising from the pond. When one of the rocks I threw landed, way out in the middle, the water bubbled up a little. Then, ripples spread in a V shape, heading toward the shore, coming straight for me, as if something underneath the surface was swimming toward me. Now, I won't name the area I live in, but we don't exactly have many alligators or crocodiles around here. Judging by the way the water moved, whatever it was seemed way too big to be anything else. I didn't stick around to find out. I turned and ran for the house. When I reached the porch, I took a quick glance back as I opened the door. There was this tiny moment between when I looked and when I ran inside. And in that brief moment, I could have sworn I saw something round poking out of the water close to the shore. It didn't look like an alligator at all. It almost seemed like the upper half of a head sticking out, watching me, like someone was swimming in that dirty, still pond. I rushed to Grandpa's room to tell him, but when I got there, he was already awake, standing by the window and looking out into the yard. His window faced the pond, so I wondered if he had seen it too. I stood beside him and followed his gaze, all the way down to the water. But there was nothing. He didn't say a word, just stared blankly, like he was lost in thought. "Grandpa, is there something in the pond?" I asked, still out of breath from running. He didn't respond. "Grandpa, please answer me. I'm really starting to get scared." "Meat." "What?" I shook his arm, watching his blank expression, trying to find any sign of emotion. After a moment, he turned to me suddenly, like he'd only just realized I was standing there beside him. In the blink of an eye, his face turned bright red, and veins popped out on his forehead. "Go clean the kitchen, boy!" he snapped out. I was caught off guard by his sudden, hostile tone. It came out of nowhere, and I was so stunned I didn't say a word, just did what he told me. That night, he didn't ask if I wanted to hear a bedtime story, nor did we pray together before bed. The only thing I could hear as I lay there trying to fall asleep was him pacing back and forth in his bedroom, muttering loudly enough for me to hear but not clearly enough to understand what he was saying. Whatever it was, it had him angrier than I'd ever seen him before. The next morning, I heard Grandpa in the kitchen. It made me feel a little better as I got up to brush my teeth. I thought that since he was back to his usual routine, maybe he was feeling better. As I went downstairs, I smiled when I heard him humming to an old song playing on his radio. But that smile quickly faded when the stench of smoke hit my nose. Grandpa slammed plates of overcooked food onto the table with such force it made me jump. Even though he was acting so angry, he had this small smile on his wrinkled face, not a big one, just a tiny, twisted curl of his lips. He didn't look at me once as he dug into the blackened eggs and grits on his plate, cutting and stabbing at them with his knife and fork. He ate with such intensity, humming louder and louder with each bite, his movements becoming faster and more erratic. The scraping sound of his knife against the china grated on my nerves. I sat there watching, too scared to ask what was wrong, but also too scared to leave the table. I knew the rule. I had to wait to be excused first, and I definitely didn't want to make him angrier. Then I remembered something. "Grandpa, we didn't say grace." I flinched when his eyes locked onto mine, and everything stopped. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like the air itself had frozen. He didn't say anything for a moment, and I wondered if I'd done something wrong. But then, just like that, he snapped back to his usual self. The creepy smile and anger disappeared, and he nodded at me, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. He looked almost embarrassed for forgetting. "Good job remembering," he said. "It's not too late. Go ahead, it's your turn this time." I closed my eyes and pressed my hands together, starting the prayer I had memorized years ago. "God is good. God is great. Thank you for this bountiful food and thank you for keeping us healthy and safe." But as I prayed, something felt off. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I opened one eye and continued, "And thank you for—" Grandpa wasn't praying with me. His eyes were wide open, his head not bowed. His hands were flat on the table, and he was glaring at me with a look that was pure hatred. It was the first time in my life I genuinely feared for my safety. His fingers rested stiffly on his fork, twitching, like they wanted to grab it and shove it into me. Even if his expression weren't enough, there was something about the fact that he wasn't praying with me, the way he was staring at me while I was supposed to be praying with him, that made everything feel so wrong. What had I done to deserve this? I felt the tears start to form. Without thinking, I stood up and pushed my chair back. "I'm not hungry. I'm going to my room." He just watched me with that furious, unblinking gaze. He didn't say a word, just stared as I walked away, his eyes never leaving me until I turned the corner down the hall. Once I was in my room, I locked the door behind me. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call my mom using the kitchen phone, but I wasn't sure if he'd even let me. So I sat there reading a book, trying to distract myself, when I heard slow, heavy footsteps approaching my door. I saw Grandpa's shadow under the crack of the door. The door handle turned, but of course I had locked it, didn't want him coming in. "Grandpa? Please." "Please what?" "Please let him in." I took a deep breath, gathered my courage and shouted, "Leave me alone!" There was a long pause. Then, in a voice I had never heard before, he spoke again. I waited in my room for what felt like hours, listening for any sound. Finally, when I was sure the house had gone quiet, I decided it was time to go. Grandpa hadn't gone back upstairs to sleep in his room, and I heard him open the front door earlier, but when I checked, he hadn't returned. I peeked out my window, which faced the side yard, where the pond began. There was no sign of him. I opened the window a little, straining to hear any sound. Nothing. The world was eerily silent, not even the usual sounds of crickets, cicadas, or owls. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Slowly, I crept downstairs, moving quietly through the dining room, across the living room, and out the front door. Standing on the porch, I checked the yard. It was empty, which gave me the burst of confidence I needed. I speed-walked across the lawn, my heart racing, and made it to the middle of the yard when I heard it, the unmistakable burbling sound from the pond. I froze. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it. A voice. Old, raspy, and carried by the wind. "Summer isn't over, Eric." My blood ran cold. Without thinking, I bolted toward the road, turning sharply to the left. I could hear the sound of cackling laughter, manic and twisted, echoing behind me. The water splashed as something, or someone, emerged from the pond. I ran as fast as I could, pushing my legs to the limit, but my breath burned in my chest, my heart pounding harder with every step. I dared not look back. I couldn't afford to. I could hear wet footsteps slapping the asphalt behind me, but I didn't dare stop. The sounds seemed to fade eventually, though I couldn't tell if it was because I outran whatever was chasing me or if it was simply because the pounding of my heart drowned out everything else. It felt like an eternity until I finally reached that house I'd seen earlier, the one just a few miles away. When I knocked frantically on the door, I was barely able to hold myself together. The lights came on, and the family let me inside, offering me food and water as they called my parents and the police. I thought I was safe. I thought I had made it. But that's when the worst part of this whole nightmare came. When the police went to check on Grandpa, they didn't find him in the house. He was in the pond. And he was dead. I never met the neighbors. I just saw their house pass by during trips in the car with Grandpa, and saw that it was a family with 2 parents, and a couple of kids too young for school. I was going to tell them that I felt unsafe and that Grandpa needed help, and give them my mom's number. All I had to do to make this plan work was get out of the house without him noticing me. I waited in bed for a couple of hours until I heard all the noises cease. I wasn't out of the clear entirely though, because Grandpa didn't go back upstairs to sleep in his room. I heard him open the front door, and it seemed like he hadn't returned by then. I looked out my window, which faced the side of the yard where the pond started, but saw nothing. I even opened the window a crack to see if I could hear him out there, but I heard nothing. Absolutely zilch, not even crickets and cicadas chirping, an owl, a bat, nothing at all. The world was silent and dead, making me feel like I was the only one in it, the only one aside from my disturbing grandfather. I eventually gathered myself to the point where I could leave the room without passing out from fear. I silently went downstairs, through the dining room, into the living room, and out the wide-open front door. I looked around while standing on the porch, seeing that the yard was empty instilled me with much-needed confidence. I speed-walked across the front lawn, and I made it exactly to the middle when I heard the water from the pond burbling. I looked in that direction. Of course, I could barely see anything since I didn't have a flashlight, and the moonlight was not very bright at all. I did hear something, though. An old man's voice whispered, reaching my ear closely as if carried by the breeze. "Summer isn't over, Eric." I ran toward the road and made a sharp left turn. I could hear him laughing, cackling like a madman as sounds of something emerging from the pond, water splashing, cut through the silence. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs, and my lungs felt like raisins. I heard wet feet slapping the asphalt behind me as something followed me, but I didn't dare look. Eventually, the sounds faded away, but I couldn't tell if it was because he stopped chasing me or because of how loud my heart was pumping in my ears. It felt like a lifetime until I reached that house I remember seeing. The lights in the windows slowly turned on as I banged on the door urgently, crying for help. This area was more lively, with fireflies glowing and toads croaking and general nightlife chorusing around me as it should. The mom and dad of that family let me sit on the couch and gave me something to eat and drink as they called my parents and the police. Arguably, this is the worst part of the story, even though it takes place after I escaped. When the police came to check on my grandpa, they didn't find him in the house at all. He was in the pond, and he was dead. He had been dead for quite a while, actually, since the night I came, which obviously didn't make sense, but the evidence was there. His corpse was decayed, the process hastened by the hot summer sun, naked, and bloated as it bobbed in the pond. My family didn't sugarcoat this to me at all, being that I kept insisting the police were wrong and that he was alive that night. I brought up the phone call, and Mom denied it even more. She refuses to believe that even happened, to the point she yells at me when I bring it up. Dad told me she was drinking that night I called. They were celebrating before getting on the cruise. He thinks I impersonated Grandpa, and that she was so drunk she thought I was actually him. I thought she sounded pretty sober though. I think deep down, she knows something paranormal was happening, but doesn't want to face it. My mom also told me, when my dad wasn't around, that Grandma died by drowning in that very same pond. It confused everyone because she never attempted swimming in it, and she didn't have anything wrong with her mentally. Yet, it seemed like she intended to jump in, as she'd taken off her clothes, socks, and shoes and neatly folded them on the bank. She was found floating in the center with a look of slack-jawed confusion on her face, same as Grandpa years later. Mom believes that she committed suicide because she was unhappy with Grandpa for a long time. She believes Grandpa killed himself too, and my brain made me hallucinate that he was still alive to cope after seeing him drown. I don't think so though. I think something's really wrong about that place, and that it took its time before claiming my grandpa. You're free to have your own opinions though.